Hi there. I want to introduce myself by giving you a little tour of my home. Right now, anyone that speaks out against the war in Ukraine is described as a Russian bot. Well, I'm a 60-year-old Englishman, not a Russian bot. And I want to give you a sense of my history so you can see where my allegiance lies. Here, if I can get it, that is a Dragon Rapide, British aircraft. I haven't flown it, but I was trained in instrument flying by Monique Agazarian, a female pilot who flew transport in the Second World War. And in that aircraft, I handed or put on my wife's finger our engagement ring. Here, one of my favourite paintings from the era of sail. And down below, Concorde, which I've been lucky enough to fly on twice. And yes, a quick little glimpse of a Buddha. But what I really want to introduce you to is this corner over here, and three particular aircraft. Here, the North American Sabre. If I was obliged to own one aircraft for my entirety of my life, it would be this aircraft. I haven't flown it, but I consider it the most extraordinary, purposeful, and sleek-looking aircraft, and I would choose it even over the Spitfire. And here we have the iconic Spitfire, and thanks to my brother, at age 50, I was able to fly in the grey Spitfire, and it fulfilled a life's dream, and it was just as magnificent as you might expect. Behind it, that is a Sukhoi 27, and yes, I flew that in Russia. And that is a really key moment, because it occurred because of glasnost. The West had won the Cold War. And what did we do with it? There were articles about the peace dividend. There would be no more major wars. And yet today, we see articles in the news about the risk of nuclear devastation. How did that happen? Well, as I say, the first thing I want to point out is that I'm hardly a Russian bot, and my loyalty remains and will remain till I die to this island and its people and its heritage. That is my heritage, is my identity. What has changed is not my position. It is the allegiance of the government and the people who rule over us. When I was in Russia and flew that Sukhoi 27, it was not the most memorable flight, even though it was magnificent. The most memorable flight was a MiG-21. I have American friends who have shot down MiG-21s in Vietnam. The MiG-21 was the symbol, if you like, for the Soviet air power. And here I was, a young British Westerner capitalist, flying this aircraft, this symbol of Soviet air power, all because we had won. And yet, in 1990, 1991, even as we had won, we began a new era. It was the era of the neocons. It's not I who've changed. It's the power that ran the Western governments that has changed. And first, we had the invasion by Saddam Hussein of Kuwait, and the West went to war. I had a friend flying Tornadoes, and I had a seminal moment when I realized that I didn't want my friend to die for oil. And my life changed from that point onwards. I recall an analyst with his wonderful German voice giving evidence before some Senate committee saying, "Let's be honest, Senator, this is for oil." And just so. It was the first of the neocon wars. Cheney, Rumsfeld, Kristol, Kagan, Rove, names that were central to the neocons by the year 2000. They engineered an entirely new game by the name of American exceptionalism. It wasn't enough to have won. It wasn't enough to allow the world to live and let live. No, America had to have it all. And so they came up with Project for a New American Century. And in that document, it had a telling phrase: their plan to take down the enemies of a certain Middle Eastern country was not going to be able to be implemented absent a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year after inauguration, by great coincidence, they had the good fortune to have 9/11, and they were able to implement their plan. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. War after war after war. 3 of those full-on invasions. That then led to 20 years of war and a $4 trillion bonus to the military-industrial complex. Technically, $4 trillion excess military spending compared to peacetime levels, of which the military-industrial complex would be expected to get about 30%. That's not a bad payoff for a couple of airplanes, if you believe in the airplanes. That 20 years war was, should we say, sidelined when World War III began. World War III was not the military confrontation between the West and Russia. It was a confrontation between the governments of the West and the people of the West, or the governments of the world and the people of the world. My suggestion is that the governments had seen that they could do anything they liked. 1 million people marched in Britain against the Iraq war. It made no difference. They realized they could ignore us, and they did. But then, in March 2020, they went further. They began a war against the British people. On Peerless Reads, I showed the analysis and putting up 90 videos from March to September. Only 2 were taken down. One, a satire, and one where I laid absolutely out in clear my claims that I would defend in court against the British government. And that video was taken down. But I can safely say, I believe, that my analysis from the very beginning, even from the very first video I put out on March 24th, having driven to Westminster to tell Boris Johnson he'd made a very bad choice with lockdown, only to realize that I was painting a target on myself because he didn't do this on a whim. That very first video still stands as a reasonable assessment of the entirety of the COVID narrative. The only thing missing was why. And Bill Gates on April 5th told us, I think it's fair to say that things won't go back to normal until we get a vaccine basically out to the whole world. Thank you, Bill. That completed the agenda. Massive threat, lockdown, wait for the vaccine. And the government admitted that they conducted a campaign of fear against us in order to promote their agenda. And I won't go any further into that topic, given the new regime we operate under, where challenging the narratives sees you deplatformed. But I will say only that the data never supported the measures that the government undertook. And I believe that is a very clean and clear statement that I will happily defend in court. And now we are entering World War IV, even as World War III continues, with the Canadian government, the American government, instituting ministries of truth, with Australia creating the most totalitarian regime perhaps on the entire planet. It is quite extraordinary, but that's World War III, and that continues. Now we're looking at World War IV. And to understand that, we have to go back to 2014, and Oliver Stone has already covered this in detail, the Duran covered this in detail, but let me recap very briefly, because anyone could find this out with a little bit of research. When my wife mentioned to me that Putin had invaded Ukraine, I was shocked, but deferred any judgment until I'd done a bit of research. And yes, I pretty much came up very quickly with the same issues that were raised by Oliver Stone and the Duran and others, of course. In 2014, there was the Maidan coup. Victoria Nuland was central to that, along with John McCain. She was famously caught selecting the new government. And I believe the American press secretary, president's secretary, whatever she is, Jen Psaki or something, tried to express, well, it's natural just to discuss these sort of things, really. Which is why she said, we need Biden's express permission, or words to that effect. That isn't discussion, that's clearance for action. And they got the government they wanted, the regime they wanted. Canada has expressed surprise that some of its people that it was training from Ukraine were of a certain ideological movement, which again I won't dare mention in the new regime. Surprised, was it? Even though the rest of us could find that out in 5 minutes on the internet. I'm shocked to find that some of the people I'm training have rather extreme views. Yes, well, very plausible. And those elements were instructed, apparently, from what I've seen, as to the number of victims that were required, 100. And they were duly delivered, as a Canadian researcher found out, from a right sector controlled building. And so the new regime was installed, a regime which promptly handed over the natural resources of the country to the Biden and Pelosi families. A nice little earner. And then the US Department of Defense installed its biolabs. And Victoria Nuland went on record say, oh, they're research labs, and the labs which didn't exist became research labs. And of course, the Department of Defense is famous for developing aspirin and similar innocuous substances. But that wasn't the main event. The main event was that the Nuland-installed government then allowed its militia and military to start its campaign against Ukrainians, Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian citizens. With the event in Odessa, with I think it was 80 protesters burned alive which right sector on their website declare to be a proud day for the nation. That is the caliber of people that we are standing with. But that still wasn't the main event, because the militia and military then started bombarding towns in eastern Ukraine whose only crime was not being ethnic Ukrainian, but ethnic Russian. And that bombardment, those bombardments continue even to this day. As an American journalist I won't name and target, but I'm sure you know who he is recording, even yesterday I think was the last one he did, showing a town bombarded by the Ukrainian forces. And that is something which is a matter of record, a matter of fact, which ironically might be enough to get me banned from YouTube, because apparently we're not allowed to have that kind of fact. It is explicit guidance that violates YouTube's new conditions. So it happens, it's recorded, it's on video, but it didn't happen. It's a violation. That is the world we live in. And if this video survives, then I guess you'll be able to see this and hear this, or I may excise it, who knows. And with 13,000 dead, finally, Putin, as they always expected and wanted, responded. What would you do if a gang was brutally assaulting a neighbor, started killing your neighbors? Would you stand by? All those Second Amendment gun owners in America, would you stand by, or would you intervene? And if the media only recorded the rabid individual who came out shooting, killing these innocent people, would that be accurate? Would that be truth? But it might serve the agenda if the media had instructions or an agenda of their own to target you. And Ukraine is really as simple as that. So we have gone from being a nation where my father's generation fought to eradicate this ideology, to now having our troops, our armed forces, arming, training, and apparently already fighting alongside, or certainly in Ukraine, training the same people with the same ideology. Those are not the armed forces that represent what my father stood for. They are not forces who represent what I stand for, what I believe in. They are not forces who represent what this country was supposed to stand for. So from 1990, we transitioned from British forces fighting for Britain to British forces doing their political masters' bidding to fight for the neocons. 1990 for oil, 2000 to 2020 to take down the enemies of a certain Middle Eastern country, and 2022 to take down the enemy of the ancestral homeland, or to be specific, the enemy and the ancestral homeland of the certain key neocons. Victoria Newland, look at her family's place of origin. Robert Kagan, I was astonished to find, is her husband. It's the same family. Robert Kagan, Project for a New American Century, 9/11, war in the Middle East. his wife, Victoria Nuland, replacing the democratically elected government in Ukraine, war in Eastern Europe. How many deaths for one family? It is truly astonishing. It is not I who have changed. It is the allegiance of the government and of the armed forces following that government. But they cannot be excused because they have internet connections too, they have intelligence services, they know who they're arming and training and fighting alongside. And it is not the appropriate behavior of the armed forces that I grew up honoring and revering. So since 1990, when we had a chance in the West to say, bravo, we won, let's get on with our lives, instead the neocons rose, and we have had a shift in allegiance from serving Britain to serving people whose ideology honors three nations, none of which we are tied to, none of which we are obliged to support. The first being American exceptionalism, the second being a certain country in the Middle East, and the third being Eastern Europe. Fighting for people with that ideology, fighting alongside, arming and training people with an abhorrent ideology, that is not the appropriate role for British armed forces. Now, I have not changed. My allegiance has not changed. My love and respect for the armed forces of Britain, up to and including the Falklands, is unchanged. What has changed is the political leadership and the willingness of the armed forces to fight for a foreign power, for a foreign and alien ideology. And that is why I am standing against these initiatives. I'm standing, as I've always stood, for a fair and appropriate behavior on the part of our nation, on the part of our government, on the part of our people. And that's what I will continue to stand for till I'm no longer here.